Hello, Biblical Mind listeners. This is Dr. Dru Johnson. And I wanted to warn you before we get into today's episode. It's this one and the next one are a little bit different. I do this other podcast called OnScript where we interview mainly biblical scholars on their upcoming books or books that have just been released. It's a great podcast. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. We also have an archaeology channel on that podcast as well. The Material World or the Biblical World OnScript podcast. Lots of things going on there. This podcast, however, seemed particularly useful to what we do at the Center for Hebraic Thought, but for a strange reason. This is an interview I did with Rabbi Dr. Shai Held about his book called Judaism is About Love. Wonderful book. If you're a Christian who doesn't understand Judaism at all, this would be a great entree into the world of Jewish thought. And that brings me to the point as to why we're running over here. One, you'll just be fascinated by everything Shai Held has to say. He's a great speaker and thinker. Two, I often get the question, what is Hebraic thought? Is it just Jewish thought? Is that what you're doing? And you'll notice that we have Jewish fellows who are research and academic fellows for the Center for Hebraic Thought. And I always say to people when I bring them on board, if they're not Christians, our primary target audience is the Christian world. However, we're happy to have anybody join in who agrees in principle with the project. And for Jewish scholars, I tell them we're not doing Jewish thought. We're not doing Jewish scholarship per se. So when they write for us or participate in things that we do, they're free to bring in Jewish thinkers as interlocutors, as people to help us think about the biblical text. But our primary goal is to think about what the Hebrew Bible is doing and how that pours into the New Testament as well. So the New Testament is Hebraic thought, or it has within it Hebraic thought, as we will argue, and the Old Testament does as well. So I bring on Shai Held. We're going to segment this a little bit into a few episodes so that you can hear what Jewish thought sounds like and how it's not identical to somebody who is thinking from bottom up within the Hebrew Bible out into the world. That the Jewish tradition, like the Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox traditions, put their current thinkers and even ancient and medieval thinkers in direct conversation with the biblical text. That's not a bad thing to do, but what we're doing at the Center for Hebraic Thought is we're trying to think what is the native thinking of the text and then put it in conversation with those other voices. So I give to you Shai Held, who I think is just a great contemporary example of a wonderful thinker and someone who is doing Jewish thought today for the Jewish people, but Christians can benefit a lot from what he says as well. And without further ado, here is that episode of OnScript. Well, hello, OnScript listeners. Today I have a special treat for you. I have Rabbi Shai Held, who is the president and dean of Hadar Institute in New York City. He has received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education, and has been named multiple times by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, in the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the most 50 prominent Jews in the world. How do you get on these lists? I need to know. I mean, I'll never be on one of these lists, but one can aspire, right?
Rabbi By the end Held, of this episode, I'll convert you, and then we'll get you on a list.
As long as we can get me on the list, I'm up for it. Rabbi Held is the author of Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, The Heart of Torah, and the book we're going to be talking about today, Judaism is About Love. So I want to begin, Shai, if I can call you that, with reading from the very last page of the book. On page 385, you finish this book by telling a little story that I want to consider. And I'll just read you here. Quote, a midrash tells us that when the people gathered at Sinai, they stood as one person with one heart. How, asked Rabbi Chaim Shmuelevitz, who was it possible for 600,000 people with a long history of conflict and combativeness to be of one heart? When they arrived at the mountain, he explains, they began to take care of one another's needs, concretely assisting others. In turn, taught them to love one another, thus fulfilling and embodying the mandate to love your neighbor as yourself. For that brief moment, at least, the people achieved a foretaste of what the Torah demands and makes possible: a community centered on love and mutual care. And then you end with this sentence: we embrace the Torah, and it leads us into love. Now, I'm fully convinced of your claims here, but I can imagine a lot of people, maybe from outside Judaism, that might not even have experience with midrashim or halakha or halachot. They would see Torah and love maybe in that classic Lutheran formula of gospel against law. How, in a word or two, can you convince us that the Torah leads us into love, or at least how you begin that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Drew, that you start with kind of the Lutheran formulation, because in many ways, what I'm trying to do in this book is overcome that dichotomy, or show, maybe better put it, maybe to put it more clearly, to show how alien that dichotomy is to a Jewish perspective, right? Law in Judaism is never an alternative to love, it's a manifestation of love. That is a kind of integral piece of Jewish liturgy. We say each morning, we thank God for God's vast love, which God expresses in no small part through giving us commandments. It's almost like the image I sometimes think about is a parent who's about to send their kid out into the world, and they say, before you go, I just want to impart some guidance for you. I want to give you some lessons about how to go through life. And I think a lot about the phrase in Deuteronomy, "Letov lach," for your own good, which I think is not a threat, but rather more like so that you can flourish in this land that I'm about to give you. So it seems to me, that you have to, in order to understand Judaism on its own terms, which is what's so important to me in this book, in order to understand a kind of an internal Jewish logic, an internal Jewish spirituality, you have to put down the insistence that somehow love and law are in tension with each other. They're precisely not from a Jewish perspective. By the way, that's why the rabbis of the Talmud can talk about the idea of simcha shel mitzvah, the joy of being commanded. It's a deeply un-Lutheran formulation, but a deeply, deeply Jewish one.
Yeah, and I want to explore that more. And, at the outset, I want to say, as somebody who's worked a little bit in the Jewish world, this probably is the most Christian-friendly introduction to modern Jewish thought, at least Rabbi Shai Held's modern Jewish thought, because you are making some proposals here, but you're collecting a lot of proposals as well and forming them together in one giant proposal. And I think for people who maybe struggle to hear what you said about the joy of commandment, that this might be the most accessible text to get you into that frame of mind. I would also say personally, just at the outset, if I can just give my own opinion, I think every Christian should believe what you just said about the joy of being commanded as well. And then I think you do a good job later of showing how this is kind of what Jesus seems to be after in various spots of his teaching.
I would say,
go
Drew,
ahead, please.
if I could, I'll just observe. It's a funny thing to begin a podcast about my book by talking about criticisms of my book. But I will say that the most interesting feedback in some ways that I've gotten from Christian thinkers, and as I think I've been in conversation with a lot of Christian thinkers about this book since it came out, is I had a Catholic ethicist, Steve Pope, say to me, it's interesting that your Shai's default portrayal of Christianity feels very Lutheran. And he said, sometimes when you describe a Jewish-Christian tension, I'm tempted to say, I, Steve Pope, a Catholic, am on the Jewish side of this dichotomy. When you talk about law as a manifestation of love, I'm like, yes, of course. And then recently another friend, Richard Middleton, who probably has been on this podcast,
right.
Said to me, as a Wesleyan, I don't love these Lutheran descriptions of Christianity that you sometimes are prone to. I don't hear Wesley in that. I hear myself on the Jewish side of this, which I found just incredibly interesting. And, it happens to be that in my own study of Christianity, I started many, many years ago with Augustine and Luther. And what Steve Pope has said to me is, if you had dived into Aquinas first, your portrayal of Christianity might sound a little different, which I found just really, really interesting.
Yeah, and quite honestly, 50 years ago, you wouldn't have had as many Christians coming to you saying those words as well. I think there's been some recent scholarship and movement in that direction as well for the good. I want to talk a little bit about method. Speaking of Jewish thinking and Jewish studies, How do you assess the views of the sages in Jewish history in informing your own view of love that you espouse in this book? And maybe I can ask you also alongside that, how powerful are halakha and Jewish ritual in informing our love in your view?
So, if I understood the first part of your question correctly, I would say that I'm always doing sort of two things simultaneously. I hope smoothly, although I'm sure not always so smoothly, which is both reading the text with the tradition of its interpretation and then also reading modern academic scholarship, kind of trying to access different types of shot that might not have always been so available. And my ideal is to integrate those two things, ideally seamlessly, but of course that's not always possible. So, to go back for a minute to where you started, one of the texts that has been most sort of formative for me is a kind of a comment that appears in the Talmud in Tractate Sotah that actually sort of, I think some people probably are tempted to dismiss as a throwaway, but that kind of has always landed very deep for me. And that is where the sages say, the beginning of Torah is loving kindness, and the end of Torah is loving kindness. The beginning of Torah is loving kindness, they say, and they illustrate that through God, creating belts or garments for Adam and Eve. And the end of Torah is loving kindness, they say, because God buries Moses in the valley. Now, there's a kind of tone-deaf reading of that, I think, which would say, oh, okay, they're saying that at the beginning of Torah there's love, and at the end of Torah there's love. But when you say that the beginning and end of X is Y, I think what you're really saying on some level is that X exists in the world to manifest Y, to bring out Y. And so when the sages say the beginning and end of Torah is loving kindness, they are, I think, providing, I experience them as offering a kind of hermeneutic, a kind of hermeneutical principle, if you will. Read this for the sake of love. Read this with an eye towards how it can build communities of love. And read this with a knowledge that the God who is behind this is a God of love. That is amplified even more in a midrash in Ecclesiastes Rabbah. The formulation is, the beginning of Torah is loving kindness, the middle of Torah is loving kindness, and the end of Torah is loving kindness. I think they're making a very grand claim there. And that's the claim that sort of animates me. That's a rabbinic claim. It's a rabbinic way of reading the Bible. Now, I'm not invested at all in sort of thereby smoothing over or pretending that there are no rough edges, right? I often say this to people, part of what it means to live with a tradition, I think, is to live with its ragged, jagged edges. It's not to make everything whole and everything work. There are texts that, as someone who believes in a God of love, I'm brought up. I mean, what? How could God possibly say this? So again, I don't. There is, of course, some degree of apologetics in any theology, but I'm not an apologist in the sense that I want to readily acknowledge that there are texts that I don't know what to do with. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, and I think it leads me to the next part of the question, which is, how does the Jewish tradition of ritual, separating that out from the actual rituals of the Torah, but the Jewish appropriation of the Torah's rituals, how do those instantiate, frame, embody, teach love to the Jewish people who practice those, at least?
Yeah, interesting. So let me give maybe a couple of examples that come to mind when you first asked that question. One, a relatively recent, a modern ritual, meaning stemming from, I think, the 17th century, but very widespread, is the practice of opening our eyes in the morning and having the first word we say be grateful. Moda'ani or moda'ani lefanecha, grateful am I before you. And I have spent a lot of time thinking about what it would mean for my life if I said that with my heart every morning and not just with my lips, right? If I really if you stand inside an orientation of being grateful before God as the centering practice that kind of begins your day, I think that is all about being oriented towards a certain kind of gratitude, which I argue in the book is kind of inextricably linked with generosity. You can't be grateful without also wanting others to have what you do. So, that's one very kind of simple example. And since we're recording this, just as the holiday of Sukkot is about to start, I will mention that there's a midrash that I really, really love, talking about Shmini Atzeret, the last day of Sukkot, if you will, where the rabbis, Shmini Atzeret has no rituals, right? It's just you go to synagogue, you pray, you have meals. There's no unique rituals to it. And the rabbis imagine God saying to the Jewish people, we've been together a lot this past month, Rosh Hashanah, Yom
Right,
Kippur,
right.
Sukkot. Stay with me one more day before you leave. I find the pathos of that just incredibly moving. It's like they just imagine a God who wants intimacy. That's all God wants. God wants to be close to people. Um, and obviously, I don't experience that every moment of my life. Would that I experienced it more often than I do. But I think that as a kind of ritual, paradoxically, this kind of like very stripped down ritual is very, very powerful. Now, in a different register, I'll just mention that there's also a whole bunch of rituals, I think, that are meant to instill in us like a deep consciousness and awareness of the needs of the most vulnerable members of the community. Now, this is not always observed, but I'll just give you one example. Now, jumping to the Middle Ages, Maimonides is very emphatic that when you have meals to celebrate the holidays, the festivals, you must invite the poorest members of the community to your table, or else you are experiencing, he puts it, not the joy of the festival, but the joy of your own belly. And I think about that sort of a lot, about like what would a kind of consciousness that says, and that's related to gratitude is open-hearted. Genuine gratitude is open-hearted. So if I'm celebrating the joy of living in covenant with God, I have to open my heart to people who don't have what God intends them to.
Okay, so I want to push this line just one more step and say, thinking about ritual, and maybe here we can think more about primary ritual from the Torah, the commanded ritual that we must practice, right? Versus love. There have been movements in scholarship to say that the prophets, they innovate. Even a good friend of mine, Jerry Unterman, has argued that that what the prophets innovated was that, or what they revealed was that morality kind of overtakes ritual. That when it comes down to it, the morality of the individual is more important than the ritual. I disagree with that a little bit, but for really nerdy reasons. But I wonder if there's a way in which you could say love overtakes ritual in some way, or can you not have love without ritual in the Jewish tradition, the commanded ones?
Right. So it's the statement "love overtakes ritual" feels like a deeply non-Jewish formulation to
Yeah.
me, right? That the Jewish challenge, it feels to me, is always to find a way to make sure that the ritual is an expression of love rather than a kind of bypassing of it. And the danger, as the prophets, as you rightly note, point out, is that it's easy for ritual to kind of be a distraction from the reality of human suffering and the needs of human community rather than a path towards it. I don't love the formulation or the notion that love overtakes ritual, but I do think the question of how ritual can spill over into life, right? In other words, if let's imagine the kind of anthropological notion that ritual provides us an alternative world to live in. So I think, in Judaism, the really dramatic expression of that is the traditional practice of Shabbat, which we imagine is sort of living in the present, in the future, what Jews call a foretaste of the world to come, me'ein olam haba. So on one level, it feels to me that the spiritual challenge is, okay, how do I make Shabbat feel more, or be experienced more as a kind of foretaste of the world to come? But then the second challenge is, how do I let my experience of Shabbat spill over into my experience of Tuesday and Wednesday afternoon? Right? How am I changed when I leave the ritual world and go back into the quotidian world? That is like a really profound question. I don't think we ask it enough. I'm not sure anyone really asks it enough in any religious community, probably because we're all a little scared of that question. Well, what if I can't? What if I feel that I don't? What if I'm forced to come face to face with the ways that, spiritually, I don't know how much I'm growing a lot of the time. But that to me is really this kind of two-step question, how to make Shabbat feel more like Shabbat, but then in a funny way, how to make Tuesday feel like it has elements of Shabbat in it as well.
Yeah, so if I can reframe what I think you just did there, is you basically said, no, ritual and love actually are meant to go together, maybe like ebony and ivory on the piano. And when you heard someone trying to tease those apart in too unnatural of a way, your first instinct was to say, how can we work harder to put them back together, or to make love be an expression of the ritual, the ritual being funded by love and extending love out into the world beyond the ritual itself?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to do, because that feels to me like what traditional Jewish spirituality is always aspiring to do. I mean, in a way, it depends what hat I'm wearing. If you ask me to be a kind of social critic, I can talk about a million ways that I feel like my community and other communities fall short of this. But
Mm-hmm.
if you ask me as a kind of interpreter of tradition, as a theologian, if you will, right, then my impulse is always going to be to do the traditional thing about weaving the two back together. And when I see the seams, not to pull them further apart, but in fact, to try to weave them back together.
Hmm. You begin the book with a chapter titled "We Are Loved," which some people would interpret as a divine passive. We are loved by God subtitle. Um, but it seems like the notion of our age is love thyself. We've gripped onto until that kind of Freudian, until you know yourself and love thyself,
Right.
which obviously has deep roots in some Hellenistic thought. You can't do anything. So I wonder why you began with not love thyself, but knowing that you are loved, or we are loved, actually, more importantly.
Yeah, I think this is a really important and actually quite a profound question. Um, I wanted to begin with a sense of human beings come second. As important as we are, we come second, God
Mm.
comes first. And that's both a theological claim and a spiritual, and for me, even I would say an ethical one.
Mm.
I don't want to start with love yourself, because although I do think that there are very important aspects of that, I also was wary of falling into the kind of narcissism of a lot of American spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
you know, reducing the venerable tradition of yoga to give yourself a gift, right? I just find some of that language kind of nauseating. I
Right.
understand where it comes from. I really appreciate what it's reacting against, and yet I don't like it. Now, I think if I were to be really honest and you were to push me harder, I would say that I also did make a concession to the reality of American secularity, and to be honest, the secularity or discomfort with theological language among many American Jews.
Mm.
My last chapter, or my last section, is about who God is. I found myself over and over again reflecting as I was working on the book, if I were really just writing this book from an internal Jewish logic, that section would come first.
Mm.
But if I'm trying to pull the American reader, and particularly the American Jewish reader, into this discourse, I can't start there. I have to start, if you will, anthropologically. But if I'm going to start anthropologically, I want to start with the irreducibly theological dimension of a Jewish anthropology. I
Mm.
don't know, that was a very kind of pretentious way of saying it, so I hope it's clear what I mean. I felt I needed to start with human experience, but it was important to me, if I was going to make that concession, to start with the human experience of something that comes before the human, of being loved already by God. When I say we
Mm.
are loved, I very much mean we are loved by God. Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, the Mishnah says, right? Beloved is the human being who was created in the image of God. We are always already loved by God. To use, language that is resonant for many Christians, and I think lies at
Mm-hmm.
the heart of Jewish spirituality, is love is grace, right? We are graced with love. We are loved just by dint of having been created in God's
Mm.
image. So it's a kind of dialectical dance I was doing there.
Yeah. Well, and I think that pattern kind of is evinced throughout the book. I think it's fair to say that you're doing very deep dives across the book into the theology of love, and through the tradition and through the text, the scriptural text, even Christian scripture as well. You're bringing it in where you see conversation partners. But I have to tell those of you who have not yet read this book that it might be the most deceptively readable book in theology I've read in a long time, where you can read along for dozens of pages and not kind of have been fully aware how much you've actually been engaged theologically, because if you have a certain way of doing theology, this does not read like that. It doesn't make it any less incisive, though, or didn't for me, and certainly didn't make it any less controversial for me. Certain parts where I had to stop and go, wait, what? And then I'm like, okay, I'm gonna read on and see what he does with this, right? And it was always an interesting turn. So speaking of deep dives, you studied under John Levinson at Harvard and worked alongside him as well, as you were telling me off air, stories that we can't repeat publicly. The I'm wondering how you see this project as different in any ways, or being having deep affinity with what John Levinson did with love in his book, which I think we have an interview with him on OnScript from years ago.
Yeah, it's a hard question, and by the way, it's a hard question a little bit because his book on love is not so fresh in my mind at the moment. But let
Oh,
me let,
fair.
let
Yeah.
me let me try to say a couple things about this. One is that I think that John and I are engaged in parallel but somewhat different projects. In that, at the end of the day, John is writing scholarship for scholars with the hopes that non scholars will kind of overhear and internalize some of what he's arguing. I think he would accept that description.
Mm-hmm.
I am writing, quote unquote, for regular people with the hopes that scholars will listen in and overhear. Like, I've made a decision to write, and it goes back to what you just said. I'm writing in a very different register than a lot of academics, right? Partially because that's just sort of the way I think, but
Mm-hmm.
partially because I have certain models of writing scholarly things in ways that smart, thoughtful people who are not full time professional scholars can read, internalize, and grapple with. So we talk, I think, in different registers because the primary audience we have in mind as we write, I think, is different. I think it's just worth sort of starting out by noting that. I think I would also say um, that, and maybe this is a little bit kind of inside baseball-y, but my reading of the love commands in the Torah are more shaped by recent arguments. For example, Jacqueline Lapsley's argument about the kind of irreducibly emotional dimensions of love that is commanded, whereas John is, I think, more in the tradition of Moran and this notion that love is not exclusively but primarily about obedience.
Mm-hmm.
My, Another way of saying that is, I think my reading of love in the Torah is more robustly emotional than John's, um, which might tell you something about our different temperaments and personalities, and might just tell you something about different kind of inclinations here.
Mm-hmm.
I was surprised, honestly, reading John's book, that Lapsley's argument had not seemed to land as deeply with him as I would have expected. And I don't know, actually, I've never had this conversation with him, whether he doesn't accept it, whether he thinks she overstates her point. I'm not really sure. But that's, I think, a kind of integral difference. Also, although in that book, John does talk about post-biblical, even post-rabbinic Judaism, as I
Right.
recall, he talks about Bachya ibn Pakuda and later Jewish thinkers. I am doing a more, I would say, kind of synchronic reading of the Jewish tradition as a whole than he, as a biblical scholar, would feel comfortable with, or at least would feel inclined to. Right?
Right.
So I have no issue moving from, I don't know, Rabbi Chaim Shmulevich, who you mentioned at the outset, a 20th century Musar teacher, and the book of Deuteronomy, because that's the project I'm engaged in. I could imagine a certain kind of historically minded reader finding my book making them completely crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What do you mean you can't do that? Well, actually, yes, I can, because I'm doing something different than you are. Right? I'm actually kind of laying out the tradition in front of me and then telling a story using the various elements. I feel incredibly indebted to and have learned immense amounts from kind of more historical critical approaches to the various texts that I work with, but that's not what I'm up to in a book like this.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. And I think I'm finding myself more attracted to people who are writing in your tone for scholars, like you said. I think that would surprise most people to think like somebody who's writing for a popular level book. I will point out it's a 400-page popular level book, so it's not a with 150 pages. You could beat your children with this book. It's heavy enough. At least a small child. I don't know about a teenager. So it's an interesting project because honestly, I saw Judaism as about love, and unless Richard Middleton hadn't emailed me directly and said you have to read this book, that might have been one that kind of went past my radar. You know, the old it's all about God is love, whatever. You know, I've heard that one before, right? And then the first few pages, I'm reading, just going, okay, I trust Richard. He's going to go, and then all of a sudden I realize, okay, this guy is actually doing something, some quite serious thinking here.
Right.
Go ahead.
Drew, if I could just comment on what you said, I want to observe, when I said earlier that my reading is sort of more emotional than John's, I don't mean that it's meant to be sentimental or sentimentalized, right? I tell you, the most profound thing any reader of mine has ever said to me about what I'm trying to do, and I hope this doesn't sound grandiose, I just actually found it really helpful, is Eric Alterman, who some readers might be familiar with as a journalist. Eric, after attending a series of lectures of mine and reading my book on Heschel, said, you're trying to do something very hard. You're asking people to feel very deeply and think very deeply at the very same time. That is a very hard thing to pull off. And I said to him, that is exactly right. That is always what I'm groping for. Can I say something that is philosophically sophisticated and humanly enriching at the same time? That's what I certainly don't always succeed at it. And not every paragraph does that, of course. But that's the kind of the aspiration, if you will, that I have as a writer or as a teacher.
Yeah, no, I think we need more of this in academia specifically. So good job. You captivated me, which is hard to do. I think, there is a general cultural call to be loving. And I think, just if you think about the intellectual history of the call to be a loving person, certainly goes on a steep incline during the 1960s and the peace movement, this kind of call to love others. But it's not a well-funded call to love. It's kind of has no real object, or it has no grounding. It's just kind of like, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures. Be good to one another, So I wonder what you think of the dangers and that kind of demand that everybody be loving, but no actual basis or motivation for it.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, although I'll note that you just knocked George Carlin, which I have hesitations about doing.
No, look, George Carlin's got his own problems, but
Exactly.
But he was great in that movie.
Yes, indeed. So, if I'm understanding what you're getting at correctly, let me try to address it in two ways. One is that the idea of love as commandment is very important to me, as opposed to merely love as impulse. I do think love as impulse is really important because this is something I actually had written for the book and then taken out, a kind of long discussion about love as a virtue in Jewish thought. I do think that kind of from a virtue ethics perspective, love as an impulse is really important. From a perspective of a kind of a biblically based theology and spirituality, the notion that love is something I am summoned to by God. It is kind of written into the, if you will, the DNA of my existence. I don't mean that literally, but right, it is written into the DNA of my existence that I am a being who is summoned to love. I am created for the purpose of love. It's hard to reduce that, I think, to kind of like sentimental, hallmarky. I actually think it's like a really profound challenge at the core of our being. I've thought over the years about what it would look like to try to write a theological anthropology centered on love, a fully developed kind of theological anthropology centered on both the commandment and the impulse to love. And also, at the other end, the tradition is very emphatic about who are some of the core recipients, if you will, of my love. It's not just like be good to one another. First of all, I mean, yes, it is certainly, love your neighbor, which is a very tall order. but also in ways that I find really kind of interesting and challenging in all kinds of formulations. Love the vulnerable.
Hmm.
Deuteronomy chapter 10, um, just as God loves the stranger, so should you love the stranger. The God who loves widows and orphans. What it means to take that seriously, to take that on board intellectually, spiritually, morally. That is very demanding stuff. That is
Hmm.
not just kind of, easily reducible to cliche. It's very hard to live up to, I should say, of course. But, I think about this a lot, the mandate to love the stranger. That's enough to spend your life trying to figure out if you've ever lived up to that in any way.
Hmm.
I'll just sort of observe that the stranger is the only person in Deuteronomy who we are commanded to love. If you just read Deuteronomy alone, we're
Hmm.
commanded to love God and love the stranger. Stranger really matters here. And that doesn't feel like very generic to me. It
Right.
feels quite, demanding in concrete ways.
Hmm. And we'll come back to those in a little while. First, I want to break it up and do a speed round here. So I hope you're ready. We're actually going
Boy,
to
here we
play a
go.
game here in a little bit. So,
Okay, sounds
um,
good.
so Judaism is about love, but food-wise, Judaism is about blank.
God help me. I don't know where this came from. The first word that came to mind was knishes.
I literally thought you were going to say knish as soon as you said the first word that came to
I don't
mind.
remember the last time I had a knish, and yet somehow,
I don't know
Dru,
if I've ever had a knish. Okay.
you and I will go to the Lower East Side and eat knishes and Gus's pickles. It'll be a
All
great
right.
time.
I cannot wait. Excellent. Whose work from the last 50 years has been the most influential in your thinking? So a contemporary scholar.
Wow. I'll start with a Christian because I happened to be emailing with him yesterday, and he's had a big impact on my thinking. Miroslav Volf.
Hmm.
One of the things I know it says I'm totally defying the rules of a speed round, but one of the things that Miroslav and I have talked about a little bit, trying to understand, is how it is that he, as a Christian theologian, and I, as a Jewish one, end up making arguments about texts that are often almost identical with each
Right.
other, and sort of why that might be and where that comes from. So Miroslav's work has been on my mind a lot. Sorry, I'll try to answer briefly. I am
No,
Jewish, so it's hard for me to do
no.
that, but I'll try.
That's good. We can handle the thinking behind the answer as well. Do you like Jewish jokes?
Does any Jew not like Jewish jokes?
Okay. So not about Jews, but like Jewish from within Judaism. Okay, so I'm going to start the joke and I'm going to see if you can finish it, right?
Wow. Good
So
stuff.
I think this will be an easy one though. Okay. Did you hear about the Jewish man that gets stranded on a deserted island? Do you know this one?
No.
And years later, he gets rescued, and his rescuers show up, and he's built 3 buildings. You do know this one?
I assume one is the synagogue he goes to,
Yeah.
one is a synagogue he doesn't go to, and one is a synagogue he would never go to.
That's right. That's exactly right. So you do, yeah. There is also a Scottish Presbyterian version. There's probably lots of different versions of that joke, but
You make me want to tell you my favorite Jewish
oh
joke
yes,
in the world.
please do.
Can I
Please
tell
do.
my favorite Jewish
Yes.
joke in the world? These 2 Jews are walking past each other, 2 old guys. One guy says to the other, "Hyman, it's so good to see you. How are you?" Hyman says, "In 1 word, good. In 2 words, not good."
I do love that. I
That is
appreciate that.
basically Jewish humor in a
Yeah,
nutshell.
no, it hits deep. It's a deep cut. Okay. Most significant book in biblical studies in the last 50 years for you?
Whoa. Well, this is not the answer to that question, but the book that most pulled me into biblical studies, John Levinson's Creation and the Persistence of Evil.
Okay, well, that's an important biblical book.
It's a very important work. I'm just, in 1 second, I'm not prepared to make that grand a claim, but I would say most formative for me.
Okay, excellent. Now we're going to play, as far as I know, this is the first ever game that has been played in the speed round for OnScript over, 7, 8 years we've been going here.
Love
now.
it. I'm honored.
Okay, so the game is simply this. We're going to go back and forth ping pong style, naming songs with love in the title.
Great. Love is all you need.
Okay, there you go. You got your first one. So what's love got to do with it?
Oh my God. How am I going to blank? This is hilarious. I love you just the way you are.
Oh, excellent. I was just playing that on guitar last night. That's crazy. Power of Love, Huey Lewis and the News.
Ooh, good song. Um,
Stevie Wonder's got one here.
Please Forgive Me, Brian Adams. Can't Stop Loving You.
Wow. Okay. I just called to say I love you.
I Can't Help Falling in Love with You.
I want to know what love is.
Love Is by the late Andy Gibb.
Oh, whoa. Okay. Bee Gees. Love Will Keep Us Together. That could have been the title of your book.
Exactly. I Just Call to Say I Love You.
Okay. Love Yourself, Bieber.
Oh, wow. That's like way after my time.
Yeah.
I don't know. Now I feel like I should come up with a Taylor Swift song, but I don't really know any Taylor
Yeah,
Swift songs.
I don't think I could pull a Taylor.
How can I possibly be stuck? Love Is Like a Rock. You know that song?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Excellent. Crazy Little Thing Called Love.
Mm. Now you prepared, Drew.
Yeah. I have a whole list here.
This is totally. This is not fair. Now I'm trying to go through the Bee Gees catalog.
I'm very impressed. I have a written list of songs, and you're actually pulling from your own memory.
Ooh, I'm all out of love.
Oh yeah,
so
lost without you. Oh yeah, okay, excellent. I Will Always Love You, Dolly Parton's version, of course.
Of course, we wouldn't quote Whitney Houston. What about Islands in the Stream? Isn't that about love? Speaking of Dolly Parton,
it probably is about Islands in the Stream.
That is what we are. No one in between. How can I don't know? Is there love in that song? I mean, it's about love. Can I cheat? And
we'll go with it. I'm gonna end this unless you got one more. To Sir with Love, an old one, which I still don't even know what that means. To Sir with Love, but I know it was a movie, right? The Sidney Poitier movie. So.
Exactly. Wow, that was one of those moments where pressure begins to cloud out your brain.
I don't know. I think you did pretty well. You were pulling them. So, and again, I was literally reading from a list. So, I have lots of podcasts I listen to regularly. I don't give money to all of them. I have certain periodicals, magazines that I read regularly. I don't purchase all of their subscriptions. However, there are some that I do give to because I believe in them. I'm more than a listener. I'm bought in on the project. So if you're that person, it's not for everybody. Maybe you want to be a supporter. Maybe you're a fan even of what we do at the Center for Hebraic Thought and the Biblical Mind. You can give at hebraicthought.org/give, and that will take you to both a one-time gift and also a recurring gift. Those monthly gifts really help because obviously, as all of you understand, that stabilizes our monthly income with which we can pay the bills. We thank you for everything you have given and for those who will give and for those of you who are just along for the ride and just enjoy what we do.